You're watching One Voice, brought to you by Asia One. I'm Kerry Alexandra. Tonight, we're continuing our look at the war in the Middle East, a conflict that's not just a war of weapons, but a war of words, a war on information, a war on journalism, and the public perception of the conflict. Of course, the management of information during wartime is nothing new. Propaganda has been a tool of governments almost as long as there have been wars, certainly as long as there have been governments. Equally, the limiting of information in the name of national security is a well-trodden path. As the United States and Iran navigate the geopolitics beyond the battlefield, there's a parallel struggle going on, a battle over who gets to tell the story on the global stage and ultimately what that story is. This is where journalists would normally come in, telling the story on the ground, sifting the facts from the fiction of government press releases and propaganda without fear or favour. But in Iran, independent reporting has long faced real challenges: journalists detained, internet access restricted, and critical voices brutally punished.
My
posts on Instagram are actually meant to draw the world's attention to internet censorship in Iran. It's a desperate, hopeless act. Deep down, I don't really believe it will change anything, but I have no other option.
While in the US, conversely, a country long celebrated for its free press, journalists and activists now say a different kind of pressure has emerged.
He's bluffing, and now he's had his bluff called. He's a consummate pathological liar, so we can't trust anything he says about what he's going to do, what he's not going to do, and therefore he has no business being in the position.
Under the Trump administration, political rhetoric, social media attacks on reporters, and public denouncements of the media as fake news have created an environment where scrutiny has a price. From public, very personal abuse to pressure to toe a patriotic line and avoid critical coverage or risk access being revoked, the MAGA management of the press has been undeniable. The Trump administration's attack on the press has frequently made the American public question what to believe and who to trust, undermining the fundamental function of the Fourth Estate to hold power to account. So tonight we're going to ask some difficult questions. Is press freedom equally under threat on both sides of the conflict? Is the land of the free and the home of the brave a little less free than it used to be? Is this really about national security or narrative control? And if both sides claim to defend the truth, who decides what the truth actually is? Joining me tonight from the UK, international public law researcher Dr. Danielle Reeder. From California, Professor Sahar Razavi, Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Iranian and Middle East Studies Center at Sacramento University. And from Erbil, Regional and International Security, Political Dynamics and Government Affairs expert, who previously worked in the US State Department, Dalal Mohammed. Thank you for joining me. Let's get into it. Donald Trump has frequently labelled major news outlets as fake news and even enemies of the people. Does this rhetoric actively reshape how journalists operate and how the public perceives their credibility?
Thank you so much for having me. In regards to this question, fake news, enemy of the people, this is not a spur of the moment kind of rhetoric that we're seeing just in response to this particular conflict. This is something that the Trump White House has, or Trump himself has been using since before his first term even. And what it's actually doing, it is undermining the entire journalistic ecosystem. Particularly within the past couple of months, we've seen more bombastic outrage expressed by Trump directly to journalists. We've seen from the White House and the Pentagon removing credentials from established journalists. Pete Hegseth, Secretary of the Department of Defense or Department of War, has also reiterated these claims of fake news. And there's been attacks against MSNBC, CNN, New York Times. These are established organizations with strong journalistic integrity. And so this continuation of calling all of these outfits fake news is really changing how the Trump White House engages with media. And it's also created this phenomenon where we see more influencers or people who would not traditionally be even called journalists given access because they listen to Trump in the way that he wants to be listened to, they agree with him, and then it's creating this de facto loyalty test. So it is altering the ecosystem of journalism in the US at the moment.
Where's the line between journalistic integrity, doing your job, which is essentially to hold power to account, and national security? If a journalist uncovers information that directly contradicts an official White House or Pentagon narrative in a time of war, should they publish and be damned, or hold back in the name of national security? Where should that line realistically be drawn, do you think?
So this is exactly what you say about balancing this holding power to account, as well as respecting the military missions of a nation. The difficulty of this, however, is that the engagement of this war isn't happening like typical wars. Even in a military operation where there are sensitive objectives that do need to be maintained, there are expectations of transparency, not only to your own legal teams, but also to the general public. When we start getting into a territory where we are no longer trusting the transparency of our particular government or the military operators, then that calculus changes. So in total, I do think it's important for journalists to keep perspective about what is the actual perceived objective of sharing sensitive information, what kind of sensitive information, the degree. If it's something about targets or locations of assets where it actually could put lives on the line, then you use that judgment call and you don't share that information. But if it's about something in which there are sort of lies or things that are being quite dishonest or sort of undermining the rule of law, then you do have to share that information. So it's not directly answering where that line should be drawn, because it's not easy, but it's about looking at the nature of the situation and where that honesty and what that objective would be.
Looking beyond the current administration, do you believe the Trump presidency has permanently changed the relationship between the US government and the Pentagon and the press, or will things naturally reset with the next administration?
I don't think anything that can happen or that will happen after the Trump White House will have sort of an easy or immediate spring back action to resetting. I mean, one of the problems is that in the Trump White House, there has been so much normative erosion. There have been so many safeguards that have just been unraveled. This complete disrespect for the press corps, this idea that you can pick and choose which narratives are favorable to you personally, and how you can control the media for a particular base. This is unlikely to go back to normal. However, looking towards the future in a post-Trump era, a lot of this social media is geared to his own specific base, which, they even have a name for themselves. They call themselves MAGA. And in a post-Trump world, ideally, if he is no longer in power, then sort of the magic hold on MAGA sort of dissipates as well, and people start blinking and looking for, the clarity in terms of that. So it will change, but it's not going to be an easy change, and it's not going to spring back immediately. There's a lot of reconciliation that will have to happen in a post-Trump era.
Let's break this down clearly. The American government is using direct pressure, while the Iranian regime seems to favor direct repression. Are they using different methods to achieve the same thing, the silence or submission of the press?
Yes, and so once again, it's important to remember that in the US media environment, there is a plurality of media sources and a plurality of voices that are contributing to what the models of control could possibly be. For Trump specifically, his method and his rationale is for his own personal aggrandizement. This is very different for the Iranian regime, whose media narrative or their purpose is to control a population and to have a certain vision and ideology that is sort of sits upon an entire country. So these two objectives are quite different.
Dr. Danielle Reeder, thank you so much for joining us today. From a more regional perspective, we're joined now by Professor Sahar Razavi, Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Iranian and Middle Eastern Studies Center at Sacramento University, and Regional and International Security, Political Dynamics and Government Affairs expert, who also previously worked in the US State Department, Daler Mohammed. Thank you both for joining us. Let me start by asking both of you, This was initially framed by both governments as a military conflict, but has it in recent weeks become much more of a battle over information? Because if you control the narrative, don't you control support for the war and even ultimately the outcome in public perception?
I think it's very much a battle of narrative and information, absolutely. There are many, people think of propaganda in very negative terms, but actually in this case, what we can see is that there's a lot of back and forth kind of psychological operations happening. Iran is putting out videos and messages. Iran's government, for its part, has been very consistent in its messaging. They deploy very similar language across different officials and different spokespeople. They try to invoke very similar concerns and feelings in the public. And I think what we're seeing also with their videos they're putting out, I'm sure you've seen these Lego videos, they're trying to shape the narrative around kind of continuity for Iran and Iranians of a struggle for sovereignty against Western encroachment. For the United States, the messaging from the government has been fairly inconsistent as far as war aims, as far as how the war is actually being prosecuted, what the next steps are, how it's actually going, what the negotiations are actually accomplishing. So we have a little bit of a difficulty in trying to find out what exactly is happening. But we're also seeing, yes, absolutely an information battle at this point.
Well, actually, the information narrative in this war, actually, let's say in the modern wars in general and in this war, it's becoming part of the warfare itself. It's not a complementary. It's not an addition to it. It's not something minor. It's in the fundamental of the warfare itself. So countries in this war and in other wars in the past 10 years have used it to mislead. Sometimes some countries use it to mislead their people, to send disinformation to outsider for many reasons, including to get sympathy from outsider, to raise the moral of their people internally, and actually to be able to blind their people of the facts, and also to be able to recruit them and send them a message that this is like a really fair war, and they all have to support it. And for outsider, countries have been using it to mislead the international community about the fairness of the war that they are taking, actually.
Journalists detained, frequent internet blackouts, and the national media tightly controlled. Iran says this is about national security during wartime. But where is the line between protecting a country and silencing dissent, or even just the truth?
It's a very difficult question to answer. For me, it seems like knowing exactly where that line is beyond what any of us can actually know. I think rather it's a matter of again, control of the narrative and what kind of justifications states deploy in order to repress free voices and free dissent. Iran, if we look at their track record, has an extraordinarily bad track record, both with human rights abuses in general, but also journalists and the free press under the Islamic Republic. Iran detains arbitrarily more journalists than almost anywhere in the world. And this has been a concern of organizations around the world that deal with journalism and press freedom. So I think the difficult part is not necessarily ascertaining where that line is, but for me, how to assess the justifications that are given in light of the fact that there has been actually external interference, but that external interference does not justify the kind of press restrictions and violence that Iran has enacted against journalists. And the mere fact of the external interference unfortunately gives the Iranian state ammunition to do this, but it doesn't, again, justify any of this. It just makes it more difficult for journalists to do their job on the ground.
In the US, journalists also now risk being jailed. Reporters risk losing access, being labelled unpatriotic, pushed towards certain narratives, or called liars if they won't toe the party line. Is that really still a free press, or just a more sophisticated form of control?
Actually, in the US case and in many other countries, modern countries cases, I mean, this is not. I don't. There is two ways in this. Actually, to be honest, let's be pragmatic. Let's not just think from the journalism perspective. Let's also speak from the government's perspective as well. Given the fact that, given my background of working for the U.S. government for over 15 years as a political specialist, I have that side of the story as well. So from a journalist perspective, it's like, okay, it's limitation of access to information, it's limitation to telling the truth just right away. Because countries like the U.S. and here in the Middle East, in the Gulf during this war, have been preventing journalists from having access or covering events, explosions, strikes right away, civilian casualties. Just saying this is for national security, for preventing the enemy to have the direct, instant information about what happened after their strike. But in the same time, you have you're preventing the journalists from the journalists. Sorry, let's talk about it from the journalist perspective. Journalist perspective, as I mentioned, is like limiting their freedom, limiting their ability to cover it like instantly from the site. But from the government perspective, is there is some part of truth from governments and formal institutions or our country's army's story. There is some truth to it. Giving an example about it, like just in the fight against ISIS in the Kurdistan region, there was a lesson learned during the fight of the Peshmerga forces of the Kurdistan region against ISIS. The press and journalists were allowed to go to the front lines, and from there they were showing the positions of the Peshmerga forces. They were just obtaining detailed information about their positions and number of fighters over there in that front. And then after a couple of hours, we've been seeing that front is attacked, either through airstrikes or through territory, just coming over there, killing Peshmerga forces and, trying to occupy those positions. So from that war, lesson learned here for this war right now, that Kurdistan region was also facing difficulties, receiving a lot of drones from Iraqi militias loyal to Iran, also from Iran, drones and rockets. So in this time, the message of the government was clear. Was people and journalists were already educated and aware of the real some real reasons behind limiting access for journalists about covering the sites of the strikes, giving information to the enemy about how accurate the strike was, so they can the next strike they can hit it well in the right site. So there is that, and there is this from two perspectives, the government perspective and the journalist perspective.
To both of you, are journalists in either country today truly free to report on civilian casualties, economic consequences, or policy failures without a backlash? Or is there now an unspoken boundary about what's acceptable?
I do. I absolutely do. And I think that's true to a certain extent in relation to every state, but there are varying degrees. And in Iran, the restrictions are quite acutely felt. Iran has been known, both in the Pahlavi era before the revolution and in the post-revolutionary period, has been known to restrict the press very heavily. And stories that are critical of the government have landed journalists in prison and worse. So we have a lot of journalists in exile. We have a lot of citizen journalists trying to do work that really professional journalists should be able to do, but are not able to do because of these restrictions. And that overall climate of fear does have a chilling effect on reporting in Iran and about Iran.
Well, actually, it's a percentage. we can't say journalists have 100% freedom to cover everything. There's no like okay 100%. Of course, it depends it differs from a country to another. But for example, like in Iraq, give you an example about Iraq from Ibar. Like if you criticize, for example, if you criticize the government in Baghdad, you just get disappeared the following day. You know, some armed militias will be kidnapping you, torturing you, and killing you, and you just disappear. There is a lot of cases of bloggers, journalists, even politicians or members of certain political parties, not in the government. They were outspoken and they were just, disappeared after being outspoken about criticizing the government or the militia, the armed militias in Iraq. You have, in the same time, for example, you have in the Kurdistan region, it's relatively like compared to Iraq and the rest and the wider region in the Middle East is totally different. In Kurdistan region where I am in Erbil, there is a lot of opposition political parties. There is a lot of independent individuals who criticize the government. I mean, like just openly criticize the government. And all you see, like we still see them there. They don't disappear. The political parties, the individuals who criticize the government, they don't disappear. They are there. They criticize the government. They criticize the political parties, the ruling political parties who are in power. In the same time, you see when they criticize, you see just some government officials comes out, saying, okay, giving clarifications, giving explanations about what some opposition said. And there are cases they confess, okay, there is this shortage here, there is that shortage here, but in the same time we have been accomplishing this, accomplishing that. So the atmosphere from a country to a country, from a region to another, it's totally different. And there is also something I want to emphasize on is the media stations themselves nowadays are you very rarely see a media station that is professional and have their employees or their journalists professionally conduct their work. So it's also important that you have, for example, most of the media stations, TV stations, they randomly just hire some people, give them the mic, and send them to war zones. Okay, and those they send to war zones, for example, they have zero training, zero experience about how to deal with children in the war zone, with women in the war zone, with people in trauma in the war zone. So there will be all kinds of violations of the rights of those vulnerable people in the war zones. This happens, and also you gave an example about the United States. Even in the United States, there is like, I can't see 100% independent media institution or journalists. Giving you an example, for example, the CNN, no matter what the President Trump does, they keep criticizing it. No matter what good job he does, they keep criticizing him. The Fox News, same case, when Democrats, whatever Democrats do, they keep criticizing it. Also, there's another thing I want to focus on. When I mentioned trainings for journalist ethics, there's misunderstanding. I mean, some people think a journalist being rude when they question officials, senior officials in senior positions like presidents and ministers, being rude, being mean. They think like, oh, he is very daring, he is very courage. That's really wrong. That concept is really wrong. I give you an example. Like recently, we all saw that journalist in the White House briefing of President Trump. He just said to President Trump that are you regretting all the lies you said to your people? He was like confused if that's really what he's hearing. He said, what are you saying? He said, all the lies you saying to the people. I mean, you can, as a journalist, if you are a well-trained journalist, if you are a talented journalist, if with ethics, with work ethics, you can ask the same question in a better way, in a polite way, in a proper way. Ask him the question. You just rephrase it in a way, in a way that you don't insult him, you respect him, in the same time you get the information out of him.
Let's talk about access. In the US, we're seeing tighter Pentagon and White House controls. In Iran, access is almost entirely restricted. Are we watching different systems, but both with the same outcome? Because if journalists can't access information freely, does it matter whether the restriction is direct or more insidious?
Yeah, I think the consequences are the same. I think the consequences may be more or less severe, but the ultimate outcome of these restrictions is very similar, that we cannot access the information that we need as a public to be able to make informed decisions about not only our voting behavior, but our safety, our livelihoods, our relationships. A free press is one of the absolute bedrocks of any kind of democratic self-determination, no matter what the governmental system is. So I think it's very difficult to make those decisions when we have when a free press is not a principle upheld by the government itself.
Journalists are being accused of dishonesty in the US. Any perspective across the board that doesn't align with the government narrative labelled as fake news or un-American. And in Iran, the consequences are far more severe, with journalists critical of the regime charged with treason. Where does it leave journalists when their government frames them as the enemy?
Yeah, of course. It limits freedom of journalism. There's a lot of examples of journalists being arrested for for doing their job, for normal daily conducting their normal daily job. There are a lot of people, like in the Gulf countries during this war, who've been arrested, just for filming something, even civilians, normal civilians, not journalists. They've been arrested. They've been arrested for filming, an explosion, a strike, or some planes. There are those cases of, journalists who've been critics to their own countries, but living abroad somewhere else. Then they go somewhere else outside that country, in a third country. They get arrested, they get brought back home, they get executed, or they get trial. So there's all types of cases. And these procedures, of course, despite of in some cases, it protects the national security. It protects, some sensitive information from reaching out to the enemy. But in the same time, of course, I agree, it's limiting the freedom of journalism.
If this continues, where does it leave journalism? Can it survive as an independent voice, or does it become just another tool in a conflict?
It's difficult to predict what's going to happen. I don't want to make the current period seem exceptional, because we know censorship has been happening in many countries for centuries. I mean, this is not a completely novel development, right? But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that the kind of constraints that journalists and journalism are facing are acute at this point. And during wartime, the stakes are even higher than ever before. So what kind of effect it will have down the line, I think on the one hand, we will see courageous journalists continue to do this vital work in the face of not only the restrictions, but at great risk to themselves, because they believe in the work and because journalism is so important and vital in society. But we are also going to see continued kind of spiral to the bottom on the part of states to keep trying to push journalists and push journalism and a free press out of the realm of what is considered to be normal in their society. And that tension, that battle, I think, is going to continue. I don't think journalists are going to give up. I also don't think states are going to give up on trying to restrict them.
Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. In times of war, information from governments is never neutral. It is crafted, controlled and curated, and increasingly it seems weaponized. From Washington to Tehran, the question isn't who is winning the war, it's who's telling the best story of how they're winning it. Because in the end, the version of events that the world believes often matters just as much as the reality of the events themselves. History is, after all, written by the victors. You've been watching One Voice on Asia One. I'm Kerry Alexandra. Thank you so much for joining us.